everyone, and welcome to the fifth week of this AuthorAid course, Research Writing in the Sciences. I'm Josie, a member of the AuthorAid course team, and I'm joined today by one of our brilliant guest facilitators, Richard. Richard will be introducing the topics covered in Unit 5 of the course, but first I will ask him to introduce himself and tell us more about what he does. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Josie, and good day, everyone. My name is Richard de Vrijs. As you can tell from my name, I'm originally Dutch, but I'm currently based in Sydney, Australia, where I'm a professor of astrophysics at Macquarie University. I moved here about 3 years ago as an associate dean, but that position has now expired because of COVID, really. I moved here from China. I spent 8.5 years as a senior academic at Peking University at an international research institute. And when I moved to China, I found out about AuthorAid about 2010. And in 2010, I started communicating with a few of the people running AuthorAid, and it's kind of escalated from there. I started running MOOCs like the ones that you are currently attending in 2014 and have been a regular facilitator ever since. It's great fun, lots of good questions, every time different questions, different groups, but I keep coming back because it's a lot of fun to interact with all these enthusiastic participants.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. So Unit 5 is titled Publishing Your Paper in a Peer-Reviewed Journal, and there are 2 lessons this week: making a good first impression with your paper and also facing peer review. Richard, may I ask you to introduce these 2 important areas, please?
Yes, of course. And actually, this is a good topic because for about 12 years, I was a journal editor of one of the main journals in my field, including as deputy editor of a top journal. So making a good impression to an editor means that your paper needs to look professional. The language doesn't need to be perfect if your first language is not English, but I would recommend that you try to weed out the worst language mistakes. Language can be fixed. Poor science is much harder to fix. And so what an editor is looking for is a polished abstract. That's the first thing he or she will be looking at to make sure that your paper fits within the scope of the journal and that it fits the aims of the journal. And then, the structure of a paper should just be a professional structure with an introduction, methods, or whatever you call that in your field, results, discussion, and conclusion. And you should do proper referencing as well, because that's very important. Editors are looking for a careful layout, a careful composition of a paper to make sure that colleagues in the field will see benefits in reading the paper. So it needs to be a significant contribution, not just a little bit extra, but really a significant contribution to the field. And so that's what editors are looking for. And depending on the level of the journal, it might be harder to get into it or easier, because some of the top journals are really quite picky in terms of which papers they accept. And you should not be too disappointed if your paper is not accepted or does not go to the peer review round when you submit to a top journal. It happens to all of us. It doesn't mean you're a poor scientist. It's just that it's very difficult to get published in those journals.
Excellent. So the second area is about facing peer review. So you mentioned it just toward the end there, but so when you do go toward peer review, what's that process like?
Yeah, that's often a black box for many starting authors, right? Your paper goes to the journal, magic happens, and at some point you get an email back from the editor, most likely, well, hopefully telling you that there were a few issues identified with your paper. Can you please work on them and resubmit to our journal? That's, of course, an excellent outcome. But really what happens is your paper goes to the journal. A technical staff person, often called a managing editor, looks at your paper to see if it complies with all the technical aspects that your paper needs to comply with for that particular journal. So read the journal instructions before submission. If that's all fine and that managing editor does not look at the science, it goes either to the editor-in-chief or to one of the other editors for handling. Now, handling means the editor looks at your abstract and your paper, looks at the quality of the figures, if it's all up to the standard that's expected by the journal. And then, as I said, the editor will look at the paper to see whether it fits the aims and scope of the journal. And if that's all good, he or she might decide to send it out for peer review. A fraction of papers gets rejected at the step before peer review because of not fitting the aims and scope, not being professional, or just in general because journals are under a lot of pressure to publish lots of papers, so they can be picky sometimes. When a paper goes out to peer review, the editor, the handling editor, so that's the scientific editor, looks for usually 2 to 3 or 4 peer reviewers. These are people working in your field. There might be people who you might know, or maybe not. Senior people could be junior people as well, usually postdoc and beyond, I would say, with PhD holders and beyond. And they get some time to read your paper critically. That's the key word here, of course, and think of ways in which your paper can be improved. That's the aim of peer review. It's not to shoot you down, it's to help you get up to that standard that meets the journal's minimum requirements. That's at least for most journals. So when you get, and then the reports go back to the editor, who will consider the reports and based on the reports make a decision. So it's very important to realize that peer reviewers don't accept or reject your paper. They advise the editor and the editor will make a decision. And the decision could be rejection if it's simply not good enough and not salvageable. It could also be acceptance right away. It doesn't happen very often. In the 12 years that I was a handling editor, scientific editor, I think I accepted maybe 2 or 3 papers the first time around. And that's of several hundred papers. It's very, very rare that this happens. Most of the time, you either get minor revision or major revision. And the words tell you pretty much what that means. Ideally, you'd like minor revision because that means you've done a good job at writing your paper. You get comments from the peer reviewers and you're expected to respond to those comments. I didn't say you're expected to include everything that the peer reviewer said, because there's an important distinction here. You may not agree fully with what the peer reviewers said. Sometimes you get competing comments from different peer reviewers. And so you're a scientist as well, so you have to make your own judgment as to whether or not the peer reviewers' comments make sense, and then respond to them. So you have to respond to each and every individual comment one by one back to the editor. And you can say that if you disagree with a comment, but then you have to explain why, and you have to be courteous. You just have, it's a scientific discussion as if you were at a conference with a colleague in the field. And so it should be a courteous discussion, and the peer reviewers should, the aim of the peer review is to help you improve your paper. Now, I realize that sometimes peer reviewers may come across as quite nasty and that they have it in for you. That is not necessarily the case, but it may come across like that. And so when you get a very critical report, what I recommend you do is you put it aside. You should read it first, put it aside for a few days, and then get back to it. Because during that time that you put it aside, it's going around in your head and you start thinking about it. And you might actually agree that what the reviewer said maybe makes some sense, right? Very often it's the case that the peer reviewers made comments because they didn't fully understand what you did. So it's just a matter of you explaining better what you did. Of course, if you have to do more experiments and more work, that's another issue. But if a peer reviewer didn't understand what you did in the paper, that's a matter for you to improve. So that, and then you send it back, you resubmit it to the journal. If it's good enough, the editor might accept it. He or she might send it on to the peer reviewers for a second round, and the same process happens again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard, and good luck to everyone on the course.